538 million years ago, something happened on this planet that science still cannot fully explain. In what appears to be a geological instant, roughly 20 million years, every major animal body plan that exists today appeared in the fossil record. Eyes, claws, shells, spines, jaws, nervous systems capable of hunting and fleeing, predators and prey locked in an arms race that has not stopped since. Before it, the oceans were quiet. The sea floor was covered in a strange living carpet of organisms that had no mouths, no eyes, no obvious way to move. They just sat there, absorbing nutrients in the dark. They looked like nothing alive today. They looked like nothing that has ever lived since, and they had been there for 40 million years. Then they vanished. Almost all of them gone, replaced by something faster, harder and hungrier, something alien and violent and spectacularly creative all at once. Scientists call it the Cambrian explosion, and it is one of the most extraordinary events in the entire 4.5 billion year history of Earth. But here is the part that keeps certain researchers up at night. Before the Cambrian, before those strange quiet organisms on the seafloor, before any of it, there is a gap in the rock, not a small gap, a gap of over 1 billion years. Rock that should be there but is not, evidence that should exist but has been erased, an entire library of geological history, torn out and dissolved, recycled back into the planet as if it never happened, over 1 billion years gone. Tonight we are going to follow the trail, from a frozen planet encased in ice from pole to pole, to the deepest silence in the geological record, to a sea floor covered in creatures that scientists have spent 80 years trying to classify, to their sudden and total annihilation, to the explosion of bizarre life forms that replaced them, creatures so strange they were reconstructed upside down and backwards for decades, before anyone figured out what they actually looked like. And at the end, we're going to sit with a question that the geological record forces us to confront. A question that is not about conspiracy theories or ancient aliens or anything like that. A question rooted in hard science, real geology, peer-reviewed research. And that question is this: how much of Earth's story has been permanently erased, and what might have existed in the chapters we will never get to read? But before any of that makes sense, we need to understand something fundamental. We need to understand how old the Earth actually is, not intellectually, not as a number you nod at and move on. We need to feel it, because until you feel the scale of deep time, none of what follows will land the way it should. So let us start there. 4.5 billion years. That is how old the Earth is. Written out, it looks like this: 4,500 million years. And the problem with that number is that the human brain was not built to comprehend it. We hear it and we think we understand it, but we do not. Not really. Because in that span of time, things have happened to this planet that make our entire recorded history look like a footnote scribbled in the margin of a book that nobody is reading. Continents have formed, collided, split apart, drifted across the globe and crashed back together again. Not once, not twice, multiple times. Entire oceans have appeared and vanished. Mountain ranges taller than the Himalayas have risen and been ground down to flat plains. The atmosphere has been poisoned and rebuilt and poisoned again. Life has emerged from the chemistry, diversified into millions of forms, been nearly extinguished and bounced back. Not once. At least 5 times in what scientists call the Big 5 mass extinctions. And through all of that, how long has human civilization existed? If you define civilization as organized society with agriculture, writing and permanent structures, the answer is roughly 5,000 years. Maybe 10,000 if you stretch the definition to include the earliest villages and the temples at Göbekli Tepe. That is it. 5,000 years out of 4.5 billion. Here is a way to feel that ratio. If you compress the entire history of the Earth into a single 24-hour day, starting at midnight, here is what the timeline would look like. The Earth forms at midnight. For the first several hours, the surface is molten rock, bombarded by asteroids, completely uninhabitable. The first simple life appears somewhere around 4 in the morning. Tiny single-celled organisms, bacteria. nothing you could see with the naked eye, and then for an almost incomprehensible stretch of time, that is all there is. Single-celled life, bacteria, archaea, microscopic organisms floating in ancient seas, building mats of slime on shallow ocean floors slowly, unimaginably slowly, pumping oxygen into an atmosphere that started with almost none. By around 2 in the afternoon, roughly 2 billion years in, the first cells with nuclei appear. Eukaryotes, the kind of cells that all animals, plants and fungi are built from, but they are still single-celled, still microscopic. The first multicellular organisms do not appear until sometime around 6 in the evening, and even then, they are small, simple and soft. No skeletons, no shells, no hard parts at all. The Cambrian explosion, the moment when complex animal life bursts onto the scene, does not happen until approximately 9:04 in the evening. Dinosaurs appear around 10:41 at night. They dominate the planet for the equivalent of about an hour and 20 minutes, and then they are wiped out by an asteroid at 11:39 p.m. The first human ancestors appear in the final minutes. Homo sapiens shows up in the last few seconds, and human civilization, everything we have ever built, every city, every empire, every language, every war, every cathedral, every satellite, every song, occupies the final fraction of a second before midnight. Not the final second, the final fraction of a second. Now here is the question that changes everything. In all those billions of years, during all those eons when complex life existed on this planet, is it really possible that nothing interesting happened before 9 p.m. on our clock? That for the first 21 hours, while the planet was churning and evolving and experimenting with increasingly complex chemistry and biology, nothing emerged that was worth noticing, because the conditions for complex life existed for a very long time before it finally appeared in the fossil record. Complex eukaryotic cells have been around for at least 1.4 billion years. We have fossils of them from rocks in China and Montana. Genetic evidence, the molecular clocks that scientists use to estimate when lineages diverged, suggests that basic animal groups may have originated as far back as 700 to 800 million years ago. That is 100 to 200 million years before the first Ediacaran fossils, before any large, complex organism shows up in the rock. Where are they? Why do we not find them? The answer is uncomfortable but important. Two things are true at the same time. First, the conditions required for fossilization are rare, extraordinarily rare. An organism has to die in the right place, be buried in the right kind of sediment, under the right chemical conditions at the right speed, and then that sediment has to survive millions or billions of years of erosion, tectonic recycling and metamorphism without being destroyed. The vast majority of organisms that have ever lived left no trace whatsoever. The dinosaurs dominated the Earth for over 165 million years, and the total number of individual dinosaur fossils that have ever been found could fit in a single museum. An entire species can exist for millions of years and never fossilize a single individual. Second, and this is the part that matters for our story, the Earth actively destroys its own record. This is not a passive process. The planet is a machine that grinds, dissolves, compresses, melts and recycles. Tectonic plates shift, continents drift, oceans rise and fall by hundreds of feet. Mountains are pushed up and ground back down. Subduction zones pull entire slabs of crust down into the mantle, where temperatures and pressures melt everything into magma. The oldest ocean floor on the planet is only about 200 million years old. Everything older has been recycled, dragged down, melted and reformed. So when we look at the deep past, when we try to read the first 20 hours of Earth's 24-hour day, we are not reading a complete book. We are reading scattered pages from a library that has been burning for 4.5 billion years. Most of the pages are gone, and the ones that survive are damaged partial and frequently missing the most interesting chapters. This is the context you need to hold in your mind for everything that follows tonight. The geological record is not a complete archive. It is a tiny, biased, fragmentary sample of what actually happened on this planet. And the further back in time you go, the worse it gets. The fewer pages remain, the more has been lost. Which brings us to a period that should have left us a rich and detailed record, but instead left us almost nothing. A period when, according to everything we understand about biology and chemistry, complex multicellular life should have been emerging and diversifying. A period that lasted hundreds of millions of years. And yet when we look at the rock from that time, in many places around the world the rock itself is simply gone. Not just the fossils, the rock. To understand what happened, we need to go back to a moment roughly 720 million years ago, when the Earth did something so extreme that for decades scientists refused to believe it was possible. The entire planet froze, every continent, every ocean. From the poles to the equator, a ball of ice hurtling through space with temperatures that dropped to roughly negative 50 degrees Celsius. They call it Snowball Earth, and what happened during and after it reshaped the planet in ways we are still trying to understand. That is where we are going next. Try to picture the world 720 million years ago. Every continent on Earth is clustered together in a single enormous landmass called Rodinia. It sits at the equator, baking under a sun that is about 6% dimmer than it is today. The oceans are vast. Life is entirely microscopic. Single-celled organisms, algae, bacteria, colonies of microbes building thin mats on shallow sea floors. Nothing you could see without a microscope, nothing that would catch your eye. And then the temperature starts to drop. The mechanism, as best we understand it, works like this. Rodinia, sitting at the equator, is subjected to intense chemical weathering. Rain falls on exposed rock, and the chemical reactions between rainwater and silicate minerals pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and lock it into carbonate rocks. Normally, this process is self-correcting. If the planet cools too much, ice forms over the continents, weathering slows down, carbon dioxide builds back up in the atmosphere from volcanic outgassing, and the greenhouse effect warms things back up. It is a thermostat. The planet regulates itself. But 720 million years ago, the thermostat broke. The problem was geography. With all the continents clustered at the equator, there was no land at the poles for ice to form on and slow the weathering. The weathering continued unchecked. Carbon dioxide levels dropped. The planet cooled. Ice began forming in the polar oceans, and this is where the feedback loop turned lethal. Ice is white. White surfaces reflect sunlight back into space instead of absorbing it. So as the ice expanded, more sunlight was reflected, which cooled the planet further, which caused more ice to form, which reflected more sunlight, which cooled the planet further. There was no break. Once the ice sheets reached roughly 25 to 30 degrees from the equator, the feedback became unstoppable. The glaciers advanced to the tropics. The oceans froze. The entire surface of the Earth was encased in ice. Scientists call this Snowball Earth, and for decades many geologists refused to accept it was possible. The idea that the entire planet could freeze over seemed too extreme, too catastrophic, too far outside the range of what Earth's climate system should be capable of. But the evidence kept piling up. Glacial deposits, the distinctive sedimentary rocks left behind by glaciers, have been found at tropical paleolatitudes on every continent. Not near the poles where you would expect glaciation, at the equator. Rocks in Australia, Namibia, China, Canada, Scotland, Colorado, all showing unmistakable signs of glacial activity at latitudes that should have been warm. Banded iron formations, layered deposits of iron oxide that had not been seen in the geological record for over 1 billion years, suddenly reappeared in Cryogenian rocks. These formations can only form when the ocean is anoxic, meaning it has no dissolved oxygen. For the ocean to become anoxic, it needs to be sealed off from the atmosphere. A global ice cap would do exactly that. In 2010, researchers led by Francis McDonald at Harvard demonstrated that glaciers had reached the equator approximately 716.5 million years ago, providing some of the strongest evidence yet that Snowball Earth was real. There were at least two major glaciation events during this period. The Sturtian glaciation lasted from approximately 717 to 660 million years ago. Roughly 57 million years. Think about that for a moment. 57 million years of ice. The Maranoan glaciation followed, lasting from approximately 650 to 635 million years ago, another 15 million years. Together, they represent the most extreme climate events in at least the last billion years of Earth history. Average global surface temperatures during these events dropped to approximately negative 50 degrees Celsius. The water cycle, in which water evaporates from the oceans, forms clouds, falls as rain or snow, and returns to the sea, effectively shut down. With the oceans capped in ice, there was no evaporation, no rain, no weathering. The atmosphere was dry and brutally cold. The planet was, for all practical purposes, dead on the surface, but not entirely, because somewhere, somehow, life survived. The debate over how life made it through Snowball Earth is one of the most fascinating in all of geobiology. Two competing models have emerged. The first is the strict snowball model, which proposes that the entire planet was covered in thick ice. In this scenario, life would have survived in a few refugia, places where conditions were slightly less lethal, near hydrothermal vents on the deep ocean floor, where geothermal heat kept water liquid and chemical energy was available, in meltwater ponds near active volcanoes, where heat from the Earth's interior created small oases, perhaps in cracks and fissures in the ice itself, where thin veins of liquid water persisted. The second model is the slush ball, which proposes that while most of the planet was frozen, a thin band of open or slushy water persisted near the equator. In this scenario, enough sunlight could penetrate the thin ice or open water to sustain photosynthetic organisms, and the water cycle, while drastically reduced, never completely shut down. Many geologists, including Linda Soule of Columbia University and NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, have argued that the slush ball scenario better matches the available evidence, particularly the evidence that some water cycle activity continued during the glaciations. Whichever model is correct, the survival of life through Snowball Earth was narrow. It was a bottleneck, the kind of evolutionary choke point that can reshape the trajectory of life on a planet. And then the ice melted, not gradually, catastrophically. While the surface was frozen, the planet's interior was not. Volcanoes continued to erupt beneath the ice, pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Normally, the CO2 would be removed by chemical weathering, but with the continents locked under ice, there was no weathering. The CO2 accumulated. For millions of years it accumulated. Some estimates suggest that carbon dioxide levels during the Maranoan glaciation may have reached roughly 350 times present-day levels, an atmosphere so thick with greenhouse gas that when the tipping point finally came, the melt was violent. The ice albedo feedback that had frozen the planet now reversed. As the ice began to retreat, dark ocean water was exposed. Dark surfaces absorbed sunlight instead of reflecting it. The planet warmed, more ice melted, more dark surface was exposed, more warming. The feedback loop that had frozen the Earth now unfroze it in a geological instant. The transition from snowball to greenhouse was one of the most extreme climate swings in Earth's history. Global temperatures soared. The oceans, newly exposed to an atmosphere loaded with CO2, absorbed enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, forming carbonic acid. The oceans became acidic, but the dissolving of all that CO2 also produced a massive pulse of carbonate chemistry. Thick layers of carbonate rock, called cap carbonates, were deposited directly on top of glacial deposits around the world. These cap carbonates are one of the distinctive signatures of Snowball Earth. Glacial rock on the bottom, warm water limestone directly on top. a climate whiplash recorded in stone. Now here is why this matters for our story. The snowball Earth events did not just change the climate. They may have fundamentally altered the trajectory of life on Earth. Before the Cryogenian period, ecosystems were dominated by single-celled organisms, bacteria, algae, simple eukaryotes. For billions of years, that had been the status quo. After the Cryogenian, in the ensuing Ediacaran period, the first large complex multicellular organisms appeared in the fossil record. The timing is striking. The ice melted roughly 635 million years ago. The first undisputed large multicellular fossils appear roughly 575 million years ago. Within 60 million years of the end of a snowball Earth, the seas were populated by organisms that had never existed before. Multiple mechanisms have been proposed for this connection. The snowball events may have created an evolutionary bottleneck that wiped out the dominant microbial ecosystems and opened up ecological space for new types of organisms to fill. The melting may have flooded the oceans with nutrients from billions of years of accumulated dust and volcanic ash, fertilizing the seas. The extreme environmental stress may have driven the evolution of multicellular cooperation, organisms banding together into colonies and eventually into true multicellular body plans as a survival strategy. The chemical changes in the oceans, particularly the rise in oxygen levels that followed the glaciations, may have crossed a threshold that made larger, more metabolically active organisms possible for the first time. Whatever the precise mechanism, the pattern in the geological record is clear. Before Snowball Earth, life was microscopic. After Snowball Earth, life got big. And strange. Very, very strange. But before we meet those strange new organisms, there is another scar from this period that we need to examine. Because when the ice melted and the world began again, something was missing from the rock record. Not creatures, not fossils. The rock itself. Over 1 billion years of it, scraped away, dissolved, eroded, recycled, leaving behind a gap so vast and so puzzling that geologists have spent over 150 years trying to explain it. They call it the Great Unconformity, and it is one of the most unsettling features of the geological record, not because of what it contains, but because of what it does not. It is the sound of Earth erasing its own memory. There is a detail about the snowball Earth that I want to return to, because it matters for understanding everything that comes after. The question of how life survived. We said earlier that life persisted in refugia, near hydrothermal vents, in meltwater ponds, in cracks in the ice. But let us think about what that actually means. For roughly 57 million years during the Stocean glaciation, and another 15 million years during the Mara Nowin, the surface of the Earth was essentially uninhabitable. The oceans were sealed. The atmosphere was dry and frigid. Photosynthesis, the process that powers nearly all complex ecosystems today, was impossible over most of the planet's surface because sunlight could not reach liquid water. The only energy sources available were geothermal heat and the chemical energy stored in dissolved minerals near volcanic vents. Life during Snowball Earth was reduced to its most fundamental operating mode: chemistry. Raw, unassisted chemistry. Organisms that could harvest energy from chemical reactions, chemotrophs, had an advantage. Organisms that depended on sunlight were pushed to the very edge of extinction, surviving only in those rare pockets where some light still penetrated thin ice or open water at the equator. This bottleneck lasted for tens of millions of years. That is an extraordinarily long time for a biological filter to operate. Everything that came after, every Ediacaran organism, every Cambrian creature, every animal that has ever lived on this planet, descends from the survivors of that bottleneck. The organisms that made it through Snowball Earth are the ancestors of everything complex that followed. And here is the thought that stays with me. The survivors were not the biggest, the most complex or the most sophisticated organisms of their time. They were the toughest, the most adaptable, the ones that could survive on almost nothing, in almost complete darkness, at almost freezing temperatures for millions of years. They were extremophiles, specialists in survival, and from those specialists in survival, within 60 million years of the ice melting, came the Ediacaran biota, the first large, complex, multicellular organisms, the first things on this planet big enough to see with the naked eye. There is something almost heroic about that trajectory, from the most hostile conditions life has ever faced on this planet, to the most creative explosion of biological form, from bare survival to extravagant experimentation, as if the bottleneck, the near death of life on Earth, had somehow unlocked a potential that had been dormant for billions of years. Some researchers have proposed exactly this. The snowball Earth events may have driven the evolution of multicellular cooperation as a survival strategy, single-celled organisms banding together into colonies for mutual benefit, sharing resources, specializing, differentiating. The very traits that define multicellular life may have been forged in the crucible of global glaciation. Others have argued that the key change was chemical. The snowball Earth events dramatically altered ocean chemistry. When the ice melted, the oceans were flooded with nutrients, iron, phosphorus, trace metals that had accumulated under the ice for millions of years. Oxygen levels rose as photosynthetic organisms recolonized the newly open oceans. The combination of increased nutrients and increased oxygen created conditions that had never existed before on this planet. Conditions that were suddenly, for the first time in 4 billion years, favourable for large, metabolically active, multicellular organisms. Whatever the mechanism, the pattern is there in the rock. Before Snowball Earth, life was microscopic. After Snowball Earth, within a few tens of millions of years, life was visible, tangible, strange and beautiful and big enough to leave impressions in sandstone that we can still see 500 million years later. The snowball was not just a catastrophe, it was a catalyst, and the organisms it catalyzed were unlike anything that had existed before or has existed since. I want to stay with the Ediacaran biota for a moment longer because their strangeness deserves more attention. Consider the problem of classification. In biology, every living organism can be placed within a hierarchical system. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. This system works because all living organisms are related to each other through common descent. They share features because they share ancestors. The Ediacaran biota break this system. Not entirely. Not in every case. Kimberella probably belongs somewhere near the mollusks. A few others may be early cnidarians, relatives of jellyfish and corals. Aurora lumina, discovered in Charnwood Forest, appears to be a genuine cnidarian. Elingia, a worm-like organism from China, appears to be a genuine bilaterian, a creature with bilateral symmetry. But the majority of Ediacaran organisms cannot be placed with confidence. Dickinsonia, the most iconic Ediacaran fossil, was confirmed as an animal in 2018, but what kind of animal remains deeply unclear. It has no apparent head or tail, no centralized nervous system, no obvious mouth or digestive tract. Its body plan does not match any known phylum. The range of morphs are even more puzzling. Their fractal growth pattern, where each branch is a miniature copy of the whole organism, is not seen in any animal alive today. It is not seen in any plant alive today. It is a growth pattern that appears to be unique to this group and this period of time. Some researchers have argued that the rangermorphs represent a completely separate experiment in multicellular organization, a way of building a large organism that life tried once and then abandoned. Adolf Seilacher, one of the most influential paleontologists of the 20th century, proposed in 1989 that many Ediacaran organisms belong to an entirely extinct kingdom of life that he called the Vendobionta. In Seilacher's view, these organisms were not animals, not plants, not fungi, not protists. They were something else, a separate lineage that evolved multicellularity independently and went completely extinct without leaving any descendants. This interpretation remains controversial. Many researchers now believe that at least some Ediacaran organisms were genuine animals, early members of known phyla. But the controversy itself is telling. 80 years after Reg Sprigg found those impressions in South Australia, scientists are still arguing about what the Ediacaran biota fundamentally were. That level of sustained disagreement about organisms that left relatively good fossils should give us pause. It should remind us how difficult it is to interpret the deep past, even when we have evidence to work with, and it should make us wonder what we are missing when we have no evidence at all. There is one more thing about the Ediacaran world that I want you to hold in your mind as we continue tonight. It has to do with scale. When we think about ancient life, we tend to think in terms of individual organisms. A trilobite here, a Dickinsonia there, single creatures frozen in stone, isolated specimens that we study under microscopes and in museum display cases. But the Ediacaran biota did not live as isolated individuals. They lived in dense, thriving communities. At Mistaken Point in Newfoundland, the fossil surfaces preserve entire ecosystems. Thousands of organisms, dozens of species, covering extensive areas of the ancient seafloor. You can see the community structure, how different species occupied different positions, how the tall frond-shaped organisms rose above the smaller disc-shaped ones, how the community was organised in space, with different zones at different heights above the substrate. These were not random scatterings of individual organisms. They were organised, structured ecological communities, the first known ecological communities of complex life on Earth. And they existed for millions of years, stable and persistent, across vast areas of the deep ocean. When this world ended, it was not a single species that went extinct. It was an entire biosphere, an entire way of being alive. The quiet, passive, absorptive mode of existence that had characterized the first 40 million years of complex life was replaced, comprehensively and apparently permanently, by something louder and more violent. The Cambrian did not just add new organisms to the world, it replaced the world. And the Ediacaran biota, those strange, quiet, beautiful organisms became ghosts, impressions in stone, memories in sandstone, waiting for someone, 500 million years later, to stumble upon them and try to figure out what they were. That is the power of the geological record. It can preserve not just organisms but entire worlds, entire ways of life, entire chapters of Earth's story that would otherwise be completely lost, but it preserves them only rarely, only under specific conditions, only in specific places, and for every world it preserves, how many others were lost without a trace? That question takes us back to the rock, not to what the rock contains, but to what it is missing, to the great unconformity, to the billion years of silence at the heart of the geological record. In 1869, a one-armed Civil War veteran named John Wesley Powell led the first known expedition by Europeans down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. Powell was not a tourist, he was a geologist, and as his wooden boat scraped and plunged through the rapids, as the canyon walls rose higher and higher above him, Powell was reading the rock, layer by layer, page by page, a geological history book written in sandstone and limestone and shale, stretching back billions of years. And then he noticed something wrong. Deep in the canyon, where the oldest rocks are exposed, Powell found a contact, a boundary between two layers of rock that made no sense. Above the contact, horizontal layers of sandstone from the Cambrian period, roughly 500 million years old. Below the contact, dark, vertically foliated, metamorphic and igneous rock, the Vishnu basement rocks, roughly 1.75 billion years old. The math is staggering. Over 1.2 billion years of geological history missing. Not hidden beneath another layer, not buried deeper down. Gone. Erased from the record as if it never existed. The rock that should have been there. The sediment that should have accumulated over more than 1 billion years of geological time had been removed, scraped away, dissolved, recycled back into the planet. Powell recognised the significance immediately. He called it the Great Unconformity, and the name stuck. But here is what makes the Great Unconformity truly unsettling. It is not unique to the Grand Canyon. It appears everywhere, on every continent. Wherever geologists find Cambrian, aged sedimentary rocks from roughly 540 to 500 million years ago, they find them sitting on vastly older basement rocks with a staggering gap in between. In the Grand Canyon, the gap is 1.2 billion years. In Wyoming's Shoshone Canyon, it reaches 2.28 billion years, almost half the age of the Earth. This is not a local event. It is a global phenomenon. Something, or some combination of things, stripped an enormous volume of rock off the surface of the continents, all around the world sometime before the Cambrian. What caused it? This has been debated for over 150 years, and the debate is still very much alive. One hypothesis points to Snowball Earth. If the entire planet was covered in glaciers for tens of millions of years, those glaciers would have been powerful erosion engines. Ice scraping across continental surfaces for 50 million years would strip away kilometres of rock, grinding it into sediment and washing it into the oceans as the ice melted. The timing lines up. The Cryogenian glaciations ended roughly 635 million years ago. The Cambrian sedimentary rocks that sit on top of the Unconformity began forming roughly 540 million years ago. The gap in between is exactly when the erosion would have occurred. A second hypothesis focuses on plate tectonics, the formation and breakup of supercontinents, first Columbia roughly 2 billion years ago, then Rodinia roughly 750 million years ago, involves enormous tectonic forces. Mountains are pushed up, continents are rifted apart. The process of uplift exposes vast areas of rock to weathering and erosion over hundreds of millions of years. Under this model, the Great Unconformity is not the result of a single catastrophic event, but of a long, grinding, tectonic process that slowly stripped the continents bare. A study published just this week in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, led by researchers from Northwest University in China and Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, analysed basement rocks beneath the Great Unconformity in the North China Craton, one of the most ancient and stable blocks of continental crust on Earth. Using temperature-sensitive minerals to track how and when the rocks cooled as they were brought closer to the surface by erosion, the team found that most of the erosion happened much earlier than Snowball Earth, between roughly 2.1 and 1.6 billion years ago, linked to the formation of the Columbia supercontinent, not the Cryogenian glaciations. If glaciation had been the dominant driver, you would expect to see a clear pulse of erosion at the time of the Cryogenian ice ages, said Nicholas Christie Blick, a geologist at Lamont Doherty and co-author of the study. We do not see that pattern. This does not mean Snowball Earth played no role. Some glacial erosion almost certainly occurred, but the new evidence suggests that the Great Unconformity is a composite erosion surface formed by multiple episodes of uplift and erosion spanning billions of years, rather than a single dramatic event. And here is why this matters for the story we are telling tonight. The Great Unconformity means that whatever lived or existed during that missing window, roughly 1 billion years of Earth history in many places, has been physically removed from the record, not poorly preserved, not hard to find, removed. The rock that would have contained those fossils, those chemical traces, those signatures of ancient life in ancient environments, no longer exist on the surface of the Earth. It has been eroded into sediment, washed into the oceans, subducted into the mantle, or metamorphosed beyond recognition. We are trying to read a book, and the first half of the chapters have been torn out. Not metaphorically, literally. The pages are gone. But the Great Unconformity may have done more than erase the past. It may have fueled the future, because all that eroded continental rock did not just vanish. It went somewhere. Much of it washed into the oceans as sediment, carrying with it enormous quantities of minerals, calcium, phosphorus, silica, iron, the exact chemical building blocks that organisms would need to build something they had never built before. Hard parts, shells, skeletons, spines, teeth. Some researchers have proposed that the nutrient pulse from the Great Unconformity's erosion seeded the oceans with the raw materials for the Cambrian explosion. The timing is suggestive. The eroded sediments flooded the oceans in the late Precambrian and early Cambrian, exactly when organisms began mineralizing for the first time. It is as if the Earth ground up its own history and used the dust to build something new. The Great Unconformity may have simultaneously erased the past and fueled the future. But before the Cambrian explosion, before shells and claws and predators filled the seas, there was an interlude, a period of roughly 40 million years when the first large, complex, multicellular organisms appeared on the seafloor. Not animals as we would recognize them, something else, something that does not fit into any neat category, something so deeply strange that scientists have spent 80 years arguing about what they even were. They are called the Ediacaran biota, and they are unlike anything that has ever existed on this planet, before or since. In 1946, an Australian geologist named Reg Sprigg was exploring the Ediacara hills of South Australia when he found something in the sandstone that stopped him cold. Impressions. Large, clear impressions of organisms that were obviously complex, obviously multicellular, and obviously very old. Older than any animal fossil known at the time, older than the Cambrian, older than what any scientist of that era believed was possible. The scientific establishment was skeptical. At the time, the prevailing belief was that complex life did not exist before the Cambrian. The Precambrian was called Azoic, meaning without life. These had to be something else. Geological artifacts, mineral formations, anything but what they appeared to be. It took decades for the evidence to accumulate. Similar fossils were found in Newfoundland, in Russia's White Sea region, in Namibia, in England's Charnwood Forest, in China, on every continent. The same strange organisms appearing in rocks from the same time period all over the world. Eventually, the evidence became undeniable. In 2004, the International Union of Geological Sciences formally ratified the Ediacaran period, spanning from 635 to 538.8 million years ago. It was the first new geological period declared in 120 years. The scientific world had finally acknowledged that something remarkable had been living on this planet long before the Cambrian. The Ediacaran biota flourished from roughly 575 to 539 million years ago. They are found worldwide. They represent the earliest known complex multicellular organisms, and they are deeply, profoundly alien. Consider Dickinsonia, flat, oval, ribbed. It ranged in size from a few millimeters to over a meter across. For decades, scientists could not agree on what kingdom of life it belonged to. Some classified it as an animal, others said it was a fungus, others proposed it was a lichen, others suggested it was something entirely new, a member of an extinct kingdom of life with no modern descendants. In 2018, researchers analysing cholesterol molecules preserved in Dickinsonia fossils confirmed that it was, in fact, an animal. Earlier, in 2017, a team at Oxford University analysed its growth patterns and found they were consistent with animal development. But what kind of animal has no mouth, no gut, no obvious internal organs? Dickinsonia appears to have absorbed nutrients directly through its body surface, from the microbial mats it rested on. It did not eat, it did not hunt. It just lay there on the seafloor, absorbing, like a living pancake dissolving nutrients through its skin. Consider Charnia, a frond-shaped organism first discovered in 1957 in Charnwood Forest, England, by a schoolboy named Roger Mason. Charnia lived in deep water, over 1,000 meters below the surface, far below where any sunlight could reach. It could not photosynthesize. It was anchored to the sea floor by a disc, like a strange flower rooted in the mud. Its body grew in a fractal pattern. Each branch was a smaller copy of the whole organism, branching and sub-branching in a pattern that looks more like a mathematical equation than a living thing. It has no modern analogue. Nothing alive today resembles it even remotely. Consider the rangeomorphs, a group of frond-like organisms that dominated deep sea ecosystems from roughly 565 to 555 million years ago. They were completely sessile, immobile, anchored to the sea floor. Their bodies displayed fractal self-similarity at multiple scales. They fed on dissolved organic carbon in the water, absorbing it passively through their enormous surface area. Some grew up to 2 meters tall. At Mistaken Point in Newfoundland, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, over 10,000 individual rangeomorph fossils are preserved on ancient deep-sea floors. It is one of the densest and most extraordinary fossil assemblages ever found. Consider Kimberella, roughly oval, maybe 10 to 15 centimeters long. It had a tough outer covering and, unusually for Ediacaran organisms, it could move. It left feeding traces in microbial mats, scratch marks that suggest it had some kind of rasping feeding apparatus, possibly similar to the radula of modern snails. Of all the Ediacaran organisms, Kimberella is the one that looks most like something from our world. It may be an early relative of mollusks, but Kimberella is the exception. The vast majority of Ediacaran organisms resemble nothing alive today. Despite roughly 200 described species, very few of them can be confidently placed in any modern group. Their body plans do not fit neatly into the classification systems that work for every other period of Earth history. Some researchers have proposed that the Ediacaran biota represent an entirely separate experiment in complex life, a kingdom that arose, flourished, and was completely replaced. What preserved them is almost as remarkable as the organisms themselves. The Ediacaran oceans were rich in dissolved silica, far richer than modern oceans. This silica enabled a process of rapid cementation that turned loose sand into solid rock in hours to years, rather than the usual thousands to millions of years. When Ediacaran organisms were buried by underwater storm events, the sand around their bodies cemented so quickly that by the time the soft tissue decayed, the sand had already hardened into a mould, preserving the organism's shape in exquisite detail. Without this unusual ocean chemistry, we would have no idea the Ediacaran biota ever existed. Soft-bodied organisms almost never fossilize. The Ediacarans are preserved because of a chemical fluke, a window of unusual ocean conditions that happened to coincide with their existence. The microbial mats that covered the Ediacaran sea floor also helped. These mats, thick carpets of bacterial slime, stabilized the sediment surface. When an organism died on the mat, or was pressed into it by a layer of sand, the mat retained the impression. The mat was sticky enough and cohesive enough to preserve the shape of things that rested on it. In the Cambrian, these mats were largely destroyed by burrowing organisms. The preservation window closed. The soft-bodied organisms that came after the Ediacarans were rarely fossilized, because the conditions that had preserved the Ediacarans no longer existed. This raises a question that is impossible to answer, but impossible to ignore. If the Ediacaran biota were only preserved because of a fluke of ocean chemistry and a microbial mat preservation system that no longer exists, how many other soft-bodied organisms lived and died and vanished without leaving any trace? How many other experiments in complex life arose in the Precambrian and disappeared without a whisper? The Ediacarans are the ones we know about because they were lucky enough to be preserved. They may be the tip of an iceberg that extends far deeper into time, or they may be the whole thing. We simply do not know. And that uncertainty is itself a kind of knowledge, the knowledge of how much we do not know. For roughly 40 million years, the the Ediacaran biota covered the seafloors of the world. No predators, no prey, no arms race and no violence, just strange, quiet, alien life, absorbing nutrients in the dark. Fractal fronds waving gently in the current, flat-ribbed ovals lying on microbial mats, disc-shaped holdfast anchoring organisms to the bottom of the deep ocean where no light would ever reach. It was a world completely unlike our own, a world of passive absorption rather than active predation, a world where the most successful strategy was simply to sit still and grow large. And then it ended, almost all of them, gone, swept from the fossil record in what appears to be one of the oldest mass extinctions in Earth's history, an extinction so ancient and so thorough that most people have never heard of it, an extinction that cleared the stage for what came next. The question of what killed the Ediacaran biota is one of the oldest murder mysteries on this planet, and the answer, as with so many things in deep time, is not a single clean explanation, but a convergence of forces that together dismantled an entire world. At approximately 539 million years ago, the Ediacaran biota largely disappeared from the fossil record. The transition from the Ediacaran to the Cambrian marks what some scientists consider one of Earth's earliest mass extinction events, and like most mass extinctions, it was not caused by a single thing. It was caused by a world changing. The leading explanation is ecological. The evolution of the first grazing and burrowing animals destroyed the foundation of the Ediacaran world. For 40 million years, the Ediacaran organisms had lived on top of microbial mats, the thick bacterial carpets that covered the seafloor. These mats were their food source, their habitat, their preservation medium. Everything in the Ediacaran ecosystem depended on the mat. And then something started eating it. The earliest trace fossils of burrowing organisms appear in the latest Ediacaran and earliest Cambrian rocks. These were the first animals that could actively move through and disrupt the sediment. Before them, the seafloor was a stable, layered surface. After them, it was churned up, mixed, biota-baited. The mats could not survive in a substrate that was constantly being turned over by burrowing worms and grazing animals. Without the mats, the Ediacaran organisms had nothing to eat, nowhere to anchor, and no way to be preserved. The Ediacarans did not die from a catastrophe. Their world was eaten out from under them, but there is evidence that the extinction may have also had an environmental component. Within the Ediacaran period itself, there appears to have been a significant biotic turnover around 550 million years ago, during the transition between what paleontologists call the White Sea assemblage and the Nama assemblage. The White Sea biota was diverse and widespread. The Nama biota that followed was much more restricted, with fewer species and smaller populations. Some researchers have linked this earlier extinction pulse to an anoxic event, a loss of dissolved oxygen in the oceans that would have suffocated oxygen-dependent organisms. There is also the question of preservation bias. Maybe the Ediacaran organisms did not all go extinct at the Cambrian boundary. Maybe some of them persisted, but the conditions that had preserved their soft bodies, the microbial mats, the silica-rich oceans, simply disappeared. Without those preservation conditions, the organisms would have left no trace, even if they were still alive. A few rare fossils that resemble Ediacaran organisms have been found in Middle Cambrian rocks, roughly 510 to 500 million years old. These possible survivors suggest that the extinction was not instantaneous or total. Some may have lingered ghosts of a vanished world, persisting in shrinking habitats as the new ecosystem took over around them. The most likely answer is that all of these factors work together. Environmental stress weakened the Ediacaran communities. The rise of new types of organisms, grazers, burrowers, and eventually predators, dismantled the microbial mat ecosystem. The loss of the mat removed the food source, the habitat, and the preservation mechanism simultaneously. It was not a murder. It was a hostile takeover of an entire biosphere, and what replaced it was something utterly different, something explosive. because what came next was not a gradual transition. It was the most dramatic burst of evolutionary creativity in the entire history of life on Earth. In roughly 20 million years, the oceans went from quiet and strange to teeming with organisms that had eyes, claws, shells, teeth, articulated limbs, and nervous systems capable of complex behavior. Organisms that could hunt, organisms that could flee, organisms that could see. Charles Darwin knew about this event, and it troubled him deeply. In On the Origin of Species, he admitted that the sudden appearance of so many complex organisms in the Cambrian fossil record was a serious difficulty for his theory of evolution by natural selection. Evolution, he argued, should work gradually, through the slow accumulation of small changes over vast periods of time. The Cambrian explosion seemed to contradict that. It looked too fast, too sudden soon, too creative. Darwin believed the answer lay in the incompleteness of the fossil record. The ancestors of the Cambrian organisms must have existed, he reasoned, but had not been preserved. He was partially right. We now know about the Ediacaran biota, which predates the Cambrian by tens of millions of years, and we know that the rate of evolution during the Cambrian was only about 5 times faster than the normal background rate, not orders of magnitude faster as it first appeared. 20 million years is a long time, it just looks fast in the rock, but the Cambrian explosion is still extraordinary, not because it was impossibly fast, but because of what it produced. Between 20 and 35 animal phyla appeared during this interval. A phylum is a major branch of the animal kingdom, the highest level of classification below kingdom. Arthropods are a phylum, mollusks are a phylum, Chordates, the group that includes all vertebrates, are a phylum. Nearly every phylum of animal life that exists today originated during the Cambrian. The basic architectural blueprints for the entire animal kingdom were laid down in a single burst. Think about what that means. Every insect, every fish, every bird, every mammal, every spider, every squid, every starfish, every worm, every creature with a backbone or an exoskeleton or a shell traces its fundamental body plan back to this moment. The templates were set 538 million years ago. Everything since has been variation on those themes. What triggered it? The honest answer is that no single cause fully explains the Cambrian explosion. A 2013 review article in the journal Science listed over a dozen proposed contributing factors, but the most significant appear to be these. First, oxygen. For the Cambrian explosion to happen, organisms needed enough dissolved oxygen in the oceans to sustain active metabolism, to power muscles, to fuel the energy-expensive business of swimming and hunting and defending. A study published in 2024 in Nature Geoscience, led by Richard Stockey and Eric Sperling of Stanford University, working with an international consortium of scientists from more than 50 institutions, found the clearest evidence to date that even a small increase in atmospheric oxygen, around 540 million years ago, may have been sufficient to trigger the explosion. Cambrian animals likely did not require as much oxygen as scientists used to believe. The full oxygenation of the oceans to near modern levels did not happen until roughly 400 million years ago. The Cambrian creatures lived in a world with far less oxygen than we have today, but it was enough. Second, predation. This may be the single most important factor. Before the Cambrian, there were no predators. Nothing ate anything else. Life was passive. The evolution of the first organisms capable of actively hunting other organisms changed the game entirely. Suddenly, being visible was dangerous. Being soft was lethal. Being slow was a death sentence. The arrival of predation created an evolutionary arms race that has never stopped. Prey needed defenses, shells, spines, burrowing ability, camouflage. Predators needed better senses, better locomotion, better attack strategies. Every innovation by one side drove counter-innovations by the other. The result was an escalating spiral of of biological complexity that produced more diversity in 20 million years than the previous 3 billion years combined. Third, ecological opportunity. The destruction of the microbial mat ecosystem opened up new ecological niches. Once burrowing organisms appeared, they could access nutrients below the seafloor for the first time. Once swimming organisms appeared, they could exploit the water column above the seafloor. The ecosystem expanded from 2 dimensions to 3. Animals were no longer confined to lying on a flat surface. They could dig down, they could swim up. Each new niche created new opportunities, which drove more diversification, which created more niches. The process fed itself. Fourth, the genetic toolkit. The Hox genes, the master regulatory genes that control body plan development in all animals, were likely in place before the Cambrian. Molecular clock studies suggest that the basic genetic framework for building complex animal bodies existed hundreds of millions of years before the Cambrian. What changed was not the genetic potential, but the environmental conditions that allowed that potential to be expressed and selected. 4. The raw material was there. The Cambrian provided the opportunity. And 5th, the nutrients. The eroded continental rock from the great unconformity washing into the oceans over millions of years may have provided the calcium, phosphorus and silica needed for organisms to mineralize for the first time, to build shells, to grow skeletons, to produce the hard parts that would both protect them from the predators and in many cases help them become predators themselves. The trace fossil record tells the story in miniature. In the latest Ediacaran, roughly 555 million years ago, the grazing trails left by small organisms on the seafloor are random, crisscrossing haphazard. The creatures that made them had poorly developed nervous systems. They could not sense or react to other organisms nearby. By the early Cambrian, the trails are completely different. Tight turns, parallel lines, organised efficient grazing patterns, and in some cases, a grazing trail that suddenly transitions into a straight line, which paleontologists interpret as an animal fleeing from a predator. That transition, from random wandering to organised behaviour to active fleeing, captures the entire story of the Cambrian explosion in a few centimetres of rock. Life went from drifting to running, from passive to desperate, from quiet to violent, in a geological heartbeat. The Cambrian did not just produce new organisms, it produced a new kind of world, a world where every organism was locked in a permanent struggle for survival, a world of hunters and hunted, a world of evolutionary arms races and biological innovations and constant, relentless competition. And the creatures that emerged from this crucible were unlike anything that had existed before, not just new, alien, bizarre in ways that challenged the ability of scientists to even describe them. Creatures that were reconstructed incorrectly for decades. Creatures that were classified as 3 separate animals before anyone realised they were one. Creatures that were turned upside down and backwards for 20 years before the mistake was caught. The best window we have into this alien world is a rock formation in the Canadian Rocky Mountains that was discovered in 1909. A formation that preserves not just the hard shells and skeletons that most fossils show, but the soft tissues, the gills, the guts, the eyes, the nervous systems, details that are almost never preserved, frozen in stone with a clarity that has rewritten our understanding of early animal life. It is called the Burgess Shale, and what it contains is, even after more than a century of study, genuinely unsettling in its strangeness. In the summer of 1909, Charles Doolittle Walcott, the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution and one of the most accomplished paleontologists in the world, was riding a horse along a mountain trail in British Columbia when his wife's horse stumbled on a slab of shale that had fallen onto the path. Walcott dismounted to examine it. What he saw in the rock changed the history of science. The slab was covered in fossils, not the hard shells and calcified skeletons that made up the bulk of the fossil record. These were impressions of soft-bodied organisms, preserved with a level of detail that Walcott had never seen. Internal organs, gills, appendages, eyes, things that almost never fossilise, frozen in stone with extraordinary clarity. Walcott traced the slab to its source, a formation of black shale high in the Canadian Rockies, near the town of Field in what is now Yoho National Park. He returned year after year, from 1909 to 1924, and collected over 65,000 specimens. The formation came to be known as the Burgess Shale, and it preserves a snapshot of life from approximately 508 million years ago, deep within the Cambrian period. The reason the preservation is so extraordinary has to do with how the organisms died. They lived in a shallow tropical sea at the base of a large underwater limestone cliff. Periodically, underwater mudslides cascaded down the cliff face, sweeping the creatures off the seafloor and burying them instantly in fine, oxygen-poor sediment. The rapid burial in anoxic mud prevented both decay and scavenging. Organisms that would normally rot within hours were sealed in stone with their soft tissues intact. It is as if someone had pressed each creature between the pages of a book and closed it before anything could decompose. The result is the most detailed window we have into the Cambrian world. And what that window reveals is a menagerie of organisms so bizarre, so alien, so far outside the range of anything alive today, that when Stephen Jay Gould wrote about them in his 1989 book Wonderful Life, he described them as evidence that the Cambrian represented a level of evolutionary experimentation never repeated. Let me walk you through the gallery. Anomalocaris. The name means abnormal shrimp, and the story of how it got that name is one of the most remarkable tales in paleontology. For 90 years, scientists had been collecting pieces of this animal without realizing they belonged to the same creature. Its grasping appendages, two large segmented arms that extended from the front of its head, were classified as a separate organism, a type of shrimp. Its circular mouth, a ring of hard plates arranged like the iris of a camera, was classified as a jellyfish. Its body was classified as yet another organism. 3 different species, 3 different phyla, all pieces of the same animal. It was not until complete specimens were found and analysed in the 1980s that the puzzle came together. Anomalocaris was a single organism, and it was the largest predator of the Cambrian seas. Complete fossils measure up to 25 centimetres, but fragments of appendages and other body parts suggest it could reach up to a metre in length, possibly larger. For context, most Cambrian organisms were measured in centimetres. Anomalocaris was a giant, the Tyrannosaurus rex of its age, a creature that dominated its ecosystem as the undisputed apex predator. Its body was streamlined and built for active swimming. Flexible lateral lobes ran along its sides, rippling in sequence, to propel it through the water. Its 2 frontal appendages were lined with sharp spines, perfect for grasping prey and bringing it to that terrifying circular mouth. Each appendage could flex and curl, allowing the animal to manipulate its food with precision. The mouth itself was a ring of 32 overlapping plates, each plate bearing inward-pointing teeth. For years, researchers assumed this mouth was designed to crush trilobite shells, and indeed, many trilobite fossils from the Cambrian show bite marks and healed injuries consistent with attacks from a large predator. But more recent computer modelling has suggested that the mouth may not have been powerful enough to crack hard shells. It may instead have been designed for suction feeding, creating a vacuum to pull soft-bodied organisms or the inner tissues of cracked shells into its gullet. Anomalocaris had enormous compound eyes, each containing over 16,000 lenses, making them among the most sophisticated eyes of the Cambrian period. These were the eyes of a visual predator, a hunter that could see its prey from a distance and pursue it. The existence of Anomalocaris tells us something profound about the Cambrian world. Within a few million years of the first appearance of complex animals, there was already a sophisticated apex predator, a creature with eyes, appendages, a specialized mouth, a streamlined body, and active hunting behavior. The arms race was already well underway. Hallucigenia. If Anomalocaris was the apex predator of the Cambrian nightmares, Hallucigenia was the fever dream. Named by Simon Conway Morris in 1977, the name literally refers to its hallucinatory appearance. Conway Morris described it as a bizarre and dreamlike creature, something that seemed to have crawled out of a surrealist painting rather than the Cambrian seafloor. And the reconstruction history of Hallucigenia is one of the most embarrassing episodes in the history of paleontology. Not because the scientists were careless, but because the organism was so alien that even brilliant researchers could not figure out which end was up. When Conway Morris first described it, he had specimens that showed a row of paired spines on one side and a row of single flexible appendages on the other. He assumed the spines were legs. The animal walked on stilts, he proposed, with the flexible appendages waving above its back like tentacles, perhaps passing food to a featureless head at one end. Someone even built a robot to demonstrate that an organism could theoretically walk on stiff spines. It could not. The reconstruction was absurd, but it was the best anyone could do with the available specimens. Then in 1991, Lars Ramskjöld and Ho Xiangguang, working with better preserved specimens from the Maotianshan shales in China, flipped the animal over. The spines were not legs, they were defensive armour on the animal's back. The flexible appendages were legs, paired legs, not single tentacles. The animal had been reconstructed upside down, but it got worse. In 2015, researchers at Cambridge University, led by Martin Smith, discovered that they had also gotten the head and tail wrong. What previous reconstructions had identified as the head, a dark blob at one end of the fossils, was actually a stain produced by decay products from the gut. The real head was at the other end, equipped with a pair of simple eyes and a mouth with a ring of needle-like teeth. Hallucigenia had been reconstructed upside down and backwards for nearly 40 years. The corrected animal is a small creature, roughly 0.5 centimetre to 5.5 centimetres long, with a tubular body, 7 pairs of stiff defensive spines on its back, and 7 pairs of clawed legs underneath. It is now understood to be a lobopodian, a member of a group of legged worms that is ancestral to modern arthropods and velvet worms. The microscopic structure of its claws, a distinctive cone in cone-layered pattern, is shared with modern velvet worms, the Onychophora, providing a direct link between this 500 million-year-old creature and animals alive today. Opabinia. If Hallucigenia was a fever dream, Opabinia was a joke that turned out to be real. When Harry Whittington first presented his reconstruction of Opabinia at a scientific conference, the audience reportedly burst into laughter. Not nervous laughter, genuine, uncontrolled laughter, because the reconstruction looked like someone had designed an animal by committee while drunk. Opabinia was a small creature, roughly 4 to 7 centimetres long. It had 5 mushroom-shaped eyes on stalks protruding from the top of its head. 5. Not 2, not 4. 5, arranged in a pattern that gave it near panoramic vision. From the underside of its head, a long, flexible, segmented proboscis extended forward, ending in a claw-lined grasping organ. This proboscis was articulated, meaning it could bend and flex and reach out to grab food, then curl back to deliver it to a mouth that faced backwards, located on the underside of the head, behind the base of the proboscis. Try to picture this, an animal with 5 eyes on stalks, looking in all directions, reaching out with a flexible trunk, tipped with a claw to grab food and pass it backwards into a mouth on the bottom of its head. It is, in the words of one researcher, like a shrimp that swallowed a vacuum cleaner. Whittington concluded that Opabinia did not fit into any known phylum. Subsequent research has placed it as a close relative of the arthropod stem group, meaning it is near the evolutionary line that eventually produced insects, spiders and crabs, but it is not itself an arthropod. It is something older, something that tried out a body plan that evolution ultimately decided not to continue. Wiwaxia. an oval-shaped creature covered in rows of overlapping scales, like a medieval suit of armour, with 2 rows of long defensive spines projecting from its back. It crawled along the sea floor, grazing on microbial mats using a rasping tongue hidden on its underside. Its exact classification has been debated for decades. Some researchers align it with mollusks, others with annelid worms. The debate continues. Its defensive armour suggests it lived in a world where being eaten was a real and constant threat. Pikaia. Small, unremarkable, easy to overlook, a leaf-shaped swimmer roughly 4 centimetres long, but Pikaia had something that most Cambrian organisms did not, a notochord, a flexible rod running along the length of its body that provided structural support. A notochord is the defining feature of the phylum Chordata, the group that includes all vertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, us. Pikaia, the small, humble, easily overlooked creature, may be one of the earliest known chordates, which means that somewhere in the tangled lineage connecting Pikaia to us, there is a direct line, 508 million years long, from a small worm-like swimmer on a Cambrian seafloor to every vertebrate that has ever lived. And then there is Cambrorester, discovered by the Royal Ontario Museum team in Kootenay National Park, a large arthropod with a massive head shield shaped like a horseshoe, with rake-like claws that it used to sift through sediment on the ocean floor. Its circular mouth, similar to an Omalocaris, suggests it was a bottom-feeding predator, vacuuming up small organisms from the mud. The researchers nicknamed it the Millennium Falcon, because of the shape of its head shield. Each of these creatures, and hundreds more like them in the Burgess Shale, represents a moment of evolutionary experimentation, a test, a trial run. Some body plans succeeded and gave rise to lineages that persist to this day. The arthropod body plan, the chordate body plan, the mollusk body plan. Others failed. Opabinia's 5-eyed proboscis wielding design did not make it out of the Cambrian. Neither did the body plan of Anomalocaris, though its relatives persisted for another 100 million years before finally going extinct. The Burgess Shale shows us a world in the process of being invented, not designed, not planned, invented through blind experimentation, through the relentless pressure of predation and competition and environmental change. Some experiments worked, most did not. The ones that worked became the ancestors of everything alive today. But the most revolutionary thing the Cambrian produced was not any single creature. It was a capability, a sense, a way of perceiving the world that changed the rules of life forever. Eyes. The zoologist Andrew Parker proposed what he called the light switch hypothesis. The idea is elegant and disturbing in equal measure. For billions of years, life on Earth existed in a world of touch and chemistry. Organisms could sense chemical gradients, temperature changes, physical contact, but they could not see. The world was dark not because there was no light, but because nothing had evolved the ability to detect it. Then, sometime in the late Ediacaran or very early Cambrian, the first true image-forming eyes appeared, probably in trilobites or their relatives, and the moment they did, the world changed. Because sight is not just another sense. Sight operates at a distance. A creature that can see can detect a predator from across the seafloor. It can spot prey from meters away. It can orient itself in the three-dimensional space. It can judge distance, track movement, plan approach routes. Vision transforms a creature from a passive reactor to an active agent. The moment the first predator could see its prey, every prey species on the seafloor was under a new kind of pressure. Being visible was now dangerous. Being soft and exposed was lethal. Being slow was a death sentence. The arms race that had been simmering since the first grazers and burrowers appeared suddenly erupted into a full-scale evolutionary war. Prey evolved hard shells, calcium carbonate armor, silica spines, chitinous exoskeletons, anything to make themselves harder to eat. Predators evolved stronger appendages, Sharper mouth parts, better eyes. Prey evolved camouflage. Predators evolved keener detection. Prey evolved the ability to burrow into the sediment, disappearing from sight entirely. Predators evolved the ability to dig them out. Every innovation drove a counter-innovation. Every defense created a new offense. Every offense created a new defense. The spiral has not stopped. In 538 million years, the trilobites, those iconic Cambrian organisms with their segmented bodies and their distinctive three-lobed form, evolved some of the most remarkable eyes in the history of life. Their compound eyes were made of crystalline calcite, the mineral form of calcium carbonate. Each lens was a single crystal of calcite, oriented along its optical axis to minimize distortion. Some trilobite species had schizochroal eyes with individually set lenses, each with its own cornea, capable of focusing light from different directions simultaneously. The optical principles they used to avoid the double refraction problem inherent in calcite were not independently discovered by human engineers until the 17th century, when Christian Huygens and René Descartes worked out the mathematics. 500 million years ago, blind evolution had already solved the problem in crystal optics that would take human civilization another 499,999,800 and some odd years to figure out. The trace fossil record captures the transformation. Before the Cambrian, the trails left by organisms on the seafloor are random, meandering, crisscrossing without pattern. The creatures that made them could not sense each other. By the early Cambrian, the trails change. They become organized, systematic, efficient, tight turns, parallel lines, evidence of purposeful, directed movement, and in some cases, a grazing trail that abruptly transitions into a straight line, a creature fleeing in a direction, away from something it perceived as a threat. That transition, from random wandering to directed fleeing, is the signature of a world that has learned to see. The other great transformation of the early Cambrian was what scientists call the agronomic revolution, or more colloquially, the substrate revolution. Before the Cambrian, the seafloor was covered in microbial mats, a living carpet of bacteria and organic material that stabilized the sediment surface. Organisms lived on top of it. Nothing burrowed through it. The substrate was effectively two-dimensional. Then burrowing organisms evolved, worms and worm-like creatures that could push through the sediment, disrupting the mat, mixing the layers, exposing buried nutrients. The microbial mats that had covered the seafloor for billions of years were torn apart. The stable layered surface became mixed and churned. The two-dimensional world became three-dimensional. Organisms could now live above the seafloor, on the seafloor, and within the seafloor. Each zone became a new habitat. Each habitat became a new arena for competition and innovation. This transformation has been described as possibly the most profound change in the history of life on Earth. It restructured the fundamental architecture of marine ecosystems, and it happened in a geological instant, driven by the same pressure that drove everything else in the Cambrian. The pressure of organisms interacting with each other in a world that had suddenly violently become competitive. The Cambrian gave us the blueprint for animal life. Every claw, every shell, every eye, every brain in the animal kingdom today traces back to this period. The templates were set, the rules were established, the game was defined, and it has been playing out ever since. But here is the uncomfortable question that all of this leads to. A question we have been building toward all night. If the geological record before the Cambrian is this fragmentary, this full of gaps and erasures and billion-year silences, what might we be missing? What existed in the chapters that were torn out? What experiments in complex life arose and vanished in the deeper Cambrian, leaving no trace at all? We tend to think of the Cambrian explosion as the beginning, the moment when life got interesting. But what if it was not the beginning? What if it was a restart? What if the conditions that produced the Cambrian, the oxygen, the nutrients, the ecological opportunity, had existed before? in different forms at different times, during those billions of years of deep time that we can barely read. We do not know. And the next chapter is about why we may never know. There is something else about the Cambrian that deserves our attention tonight. Something that goes beyond the individual organisms and speaks to the nature of evolutionary change itself. Before the Cambrian, life on Earth had been playing one game, a quiet game, a game of chemistry and gradual adaptation. For billions of years, single-celled organisms had been slowly optimizing their biochemistry, developing new metabolic pathways, learning to harvest energy from sunlight, from minerals, from chemical gradients in the water. It was a game of efficiency, of slow, incremental improvement. No organism ate another organism. No organism competed with another organism in any direct physical way. Life existed side by side, each species occupying its own chemical niche, like vendors at a market who never speak to each other. The Ediacaran biota changed the scale but not the rules. They were larger, more complex, multicellular, but they played the same quiet game. They absorbed nutrients, they grew, they reproduced, they did not interact with each other in any meaningful way. The Ediacaran seafloor was a community of individuals that happened to share space, not a network of organisms that depended on and competed with each other. The Cambrian changed the rules. The moment one organism evolved, the ability to consume another organism, life on Earth switched from a chemistry game to a strategy game. And strategy games are fundamentally different from chemistry games. In a chemistry game, your success depends on your internal processes. In a strategy game, your success depends on what everyone else is doing. Your survival is not determined by how efficiently you photosynthesize or how quickly you absorb dissolved nutrients. It is determined by whether you can outrun the thing trying to eat you, or outmaneuver the thing you are trying to eat. This is a ratchet. Once it starts, it cannot stop, because every improvement by one side creates pressure on the other side to improve. Every new defense creates selection pressure for a new offense. Every new offense creates selection pressure for a new defense. The result is an escalating spiral of complexity and capability that feeds on itself, generating more diversity, more specialization, more sophisticated behavior with each generation. The Cambrian explosion was not just an explosion of body plans, it was the invention of ecology as we know it, the invention of food webs, the invention of competition, the invention of the dynamic, interactive, constantly evolving biosphere that has characterized life on Earth ever since. Before the Cambrian, the biosphere was a collection of organisms living in parallel. After the Cambrian, the biosphere was a system of organisms living in a relationship. Predator and prey, host and parasite, competitor and cooperator. Every organism was now defined not just by what it was, but by its position in a network of interactions. That network has only grown more complex in the 538 million years since. Think about what this means for understanding evolution. The rate of evolutionary change is not constant. It depends on the selective pressures acting on organisms. In a world with no predators, there is relatively little pressure to change. If you are absorbing nutrients passively, and nothing is trying to eat you, you can afford to stay the same for millions of years. The Ediacaran biota did exactly that. Their body plans remained remarkably stable throughout their 40 million year tenure. But in a world with predators, stasis is death. The prey that does not change gets eaten. The predator that does not improve gets outcompeted. The arms race drives both sides to innovate, and the rate of innovation accelerates because each innovation by one side immediately creates pressure on the other. This is why the Cambrian produced more morphological diversity in 20 million years than the previous 3 billion years combined. The engine of change had been turned on, and it was running at full speed for the first time. The trilobites are perhaps the best example of this accelerated evolution in action. They first appeared in the early Cambrian, roughly 521 million years ago, and they lasted for nearly 300 million years, finally going extinct in the Great Permian mass extinction roughly 252 million years ago. In those 300 million years, over 25,000 species of trilobite evolved. They range in size from less than a millimetre to over 70 centimetres. They lived in every marine environment, from shallow coastal waters to the deep ocean floor. Some were bottom feeders, some were active swimmers, some were filter feeders, some were predators, some burrowed into the sediment, some lived on reefs, and their eyes. The trilobite compound eye was a masterpiece of biological engineering. Each eye consisted of hundreds to thousands of individual lenses, each made of a single crystal of calcite. The calcite was oriented along its optical axis so that light passed through the crystal without double refraction, a property called birefringence that causes blurring in most calcite crystals. The trilobites had solved this problem by orienting each lens precisely along the axis of maximum clarity. Some trilobite species evolved holochroal eyes, with many lenses packed closely together under a single corneal membrane, providing a wide field of vision with relatively low resolution, similar to the compound eyes of modern insects. Others evolved the schizochroal eyes, with fewer but larger lenses, each with its own cornea, providing a higher resolution, but a narrower field of view. These schizochroal eyes appear to have been able to focus individually, like tiny telescopes, allowing the trilobite to detect fine detail at a distance. A few species evolved eyes with doublet lenses, two lens elements stacked together to correct for spherical aberration, the blurring that occurs at the edges of a curved lens. This doublet lens design was not reinvented by human optical engineers until the 18th century. 500 million years of evolution had produced an optical instrument that human technology could not match for 499,999,700 years. And trilobites were not the only Cambrian organisms with sophisticated sensory systems. Anomalocaris had enormous compound eyes with over 16,000 lenses each, the highest lens counter of any known Cambrian arthropod. These eyes would have given it exceptional visual acuity, allowing it to track prey at distances that no other Cambrian predator could match. It was the eagle of the Cambrian seas, a visual hunter par excellence. Even some of the smaller, less dramatic Cambrian organisms show evidence of sophisticated sensory adaptation. Trace fossils from the early Cambrian show increasingly complex burrowing patterns, with organisms creating U-shaped tubes, spiral burrows, and branching networks that suggest they were actively mapping their environment and responding to chemical gradients in the sediment. This is not the behaviour of simple organisms. This is the behaviour of creatures with nervous systems capable of processing environmental information and making decisions. The Cambrian did not just produce new body plans, it produced new behaviours, new ways of interacting with the environment and with other organisms, new levels of awareness and responsiveness that had never existed before, and all of it was driven by the same engine: predation, competition, the inescapable reality that in a world where organisms eat other organisms, you must either adapt or die. The Ediacaran world had been a garden. The Cambrian world was a battlefield. There is a term that paleontologists use for the transition from the Ediacaran to the Cambrian biosphere. They call it the agronomic revolution, or the Cambrian substrate revolution. It refers specifically to the transformation of the seafloor from a stable mat-covered surface to a churned, bioturbated substrate. But the term applies more broadly than that. The Cambrian did not just change the substrate, it changed the entire operating system of life on Earth. It installed a new set of rules that are still in effect today, rules that govern every ecosystem on the planet. Before the Cambrian, the rule was absorb, grow, persist. After the Cambrian, the rule was compete, adapt, or go extinct. That is the world we inherited. That is the world we live in. Every predator that has ever hunted, every prey that has ever fled, every parasite that has ever exploited a host, every organism that has ever competed for a mate or a territory or a resource is playing a game that was invented on the seafloor of the early Cambrian. We are 538 million years into that game, and we are still playing it, still innovating, still adapting, still locked in the same arms race that began when the first organism learned to eat another. That is the Cambrian's legacy, not just a collection of bizarre fossils in a rock formation in the Canadian Rockies. A revolution. A change in the fundamental nature of life that was as irreversible as it was explosive. But understanding the Cambrian is one thing. Understanding what it tells us about the limits of our knowledge is another. Because if the most dramatic event in the history of complex life was preceded by billions of years of near silence in the fossil record, what might that silence be hiding? If the Ediacaran biota were only discovered because of a chemical accident of preservation, what else has been lost? If over 1 billion years of rock has been physically removed from the geological record, what story was written on those pages before they were torn out? These are the questions that keep certain researchers awake at night. Not because they have answers, but because the questions themselves reveal something uncomfortable about the relationship between what happened and what we can know about what happened. And that gap, the gap between reality and the surviving record, is the subject of our next and final inquiry tonight. Let us pause here and talk about something that most documentaries about ancient life quietly avoid. Not the question of what lived in the deep past, but the question of whether we could even find it if it had. Because the Earth is not a museum. It is not a library. It is not an archive that carefully preserves its contents for future readers. The Earth is a machine. A recycling machine that grinds, dissolves, compresses, melts, and erases. And it has been running for 4.5 billion years. In 2018, 2 scientists decided to take this problem seriously. Their names are Adam Frank and Gavin Schmidt. Frank is an astrophysicist at the University of Rochester. Schmidt is a climate scientist and the director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. These are not fringe thinkers. These are mainstream scientists with long publication records and institutional credentials. What they proposed was not an answer. It was a question. A question that sounds simple but turns out to be profoundly unsettling. If an industrial civilization had existed on Earth millions of years before us, would we even be able to detect it? They called it the Silurian hypothesis, borrowing the name with a wink from a 1970 episode of the British science fiction show Doctor Who, in which a race of intelligent reptilian beings is discovered to have lived on Earth millions of years before humans. Frank and Schmidt were not claiming that lizard people built cities in the Jurassic. They were asking something far more precise. What are the limits of our ability to see into the deep past? Their analysis was sobering. Think about what our civilization would leave behind. Cities, roads, bridges, plastic, glass, concrete, steel. Now think about what happens to those things over geological time, not over centuries, over millions of years. Within a few thousand years, most structures above ground are reduced to rubble and buried under soil. Within 100,000 years, the last physical traces of our cities are geological layers, thin bands of unusual chemistry, concrete fragments, microplastics, elevated levels of heavy metals, radioactive isotopes from nuclear testing. Within 1 million years, tectonic processes have resurfaced entire regions. Rivers have changed course, coastlines have shifted. The specific locations of our cities are no longer identifiable from the surface. Within 10 million years, most of the evidence has been subducted, eroded, or metamorphosed beyond recognition. Within 50 million years, virtually nothing physical remains. No structures, no artifacts, no fossils, because the conditions required for fossilization are rare. The dinosaurs dominated the Earth for over 165 million years, and the total number of individual dinosaur fossils ever found represents an infinitesimal fraction of the individuals that lived. A technological civilization lasting a few thousand years would be extraordinarily lucky to leave a single fossilized individual. What would remain are chemical whispers, isotopic ratios, thin layers of unusual elemental concentrations in deep-sea sediment cores, carbon isotope excursions, spikes in certain trace metals, traces of synthetic molecules. The kinds of signals that geologists find all the time and routinely attribute to volcanism, methane releases, orbital shifts or other natural processes, because until Frankenschmidt asked the question, nobody was looking for anything else. Now, Frankenschmidt were very careful. They explicitly stated that they strongly doubted any previous industrial civilization existed on Earth. They were not trying to prove one had. They were trying to ask whether our scientific tools could even detect one if it had existed, and the honest answer they arrived at was humbling. In most cases, no. The signals that an industrial civilization would leave behind: a spike in the carbon isotopes from burning fossil fuels, elevated levels of synthetic chemicals, a brief pulse of radioactive elements, would be subtle, ambiguous, and in many cases indistinguishable from natural geological events. A civilization that burned through its fossil fuel reserves in a few centuries would leave a carbon isotope signature essentially identical to a natural methane hydrate release. A civilization that was more sustainable, running on solar or wind or geothermal energy, would leave almost no trace at all. And here is the paradox at the heart of the hypothesis. The more sustainable a civilization is, the smaller its footprint. The smaller its footprint, the harder it is to detect. The civilizations we would most like to find, the ones that figured out how to live in balance with their planet, are precisely the ones that would leave no evidence of their existence. Now I want to apply this logic, not to industrial civilizations, which is speculative, but to something far more grounded. To the question of complex life in the deeper Precambrian. We know that single-celled organisms have existed on Earth for at least 3.5 billion years. We know that eukaryotic cells, the complex cells with nuclei from which all animals, plants and fungi are built, have existed for at least 1.4 billion years. We know from molecular clock studies that the basic animal lineages may have diverged as far back as 700 to 800 million years ago, at least 100 million years before the first Ediacaran fossils appear in the rock. Where are the fossils from that 100 to 200 million year gap? Where is the physical evidence of those earliest animal lineages? The answer is the same answer that haunts the entire Precambrian. The evidence, if it ever existed, has been destroyed by the same processes that destroy everything on geological timescales: erosion, subduction, metamorphism, the recycling of the ocean floor, the great unconformity, the systematic, relentless destruction of surface material by a planet that has been grinding itself down for 4.5 billion years. Consider the specific challenges: soft-bodied organisms, organisms without shells or skeletons, almost never fossilize. The Ediacaran biota were preserved because of a specific combination of factors that happened to coincide: silica-rich oceans, microbial mats, rapid cementation. Without those conditions, soft-bodied organisms decay completely within days to weeks. They leave no trace. If similar organisms existed before the Ediacaran window, during a time when ocean chemistry was different, when microbial mats were less developed, when the specific conditions for preservation did not apply, we would have no way of knowing. Consider the ocean floor. 71% of the Earth's surface is water. The ocean floor is created at mid-ocean ridges, where magma rises and solidifies into new crust, and destroyed at subduction zones, where old crust dives back into the mantle. The oldest ocean floor on the planet is about 200 million years old. Everything older has been recycled, melted, destroyed. Any evidence of anything that happened on the ocean floor more than 200 million years ago is gone, permanently, melted back into the interior of the Earth. Continental crust is older. Some continental rocks are nearly 4 billion years old. but exposed continental surface from the deep Precambrian is rare. Most of the Earth's continental surface has been resurfaced by erosion, sedimentation, glaciation, volcanism, or tectonic deformation. Finding undisturbed surface material from 500 million years ago is difficult. Finding it from 1 billion years ago is extraordinarily challenging. From 2 billion years ago, it is a needle in a continental haystack. And then there is the great unconformity itself. As we discussed earlier, over 1 billion years of rock has been physically removed from the continental record in many places around the world. Whatever was in that rock, whatever fossils, whatever chemical traces, whatever evidence of ancient life or ancient environments it contained, has been erased, not hidden, erased. The pages have been torn from the book and burned. This does not mean that complex life existed before the Ediacaran. The most parsimonious explanation, the simplest interpretation of the evidence we have, is that complex multicellular life genuinely did not evolve until the Ediacaran period, that the billions of years before it were dominated by single-celled organisms and simple multicellular forms that did not achieve the complexity of the Ediacaran biota. This is the mainstream scientific view, and it is well supported by the available evidence. But the available evidence is incomplete. That is the point. The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, especially in a system where evidence is systematically destroyed over time. We are confident that complex life did not exist before the Ediacaran because we have not found it. But we also know that our ability to find it is severely limited by the incompleteness of the geological record. We know that the further back in time we look, the less record there is to examine. We know that entire categories of organisms, soft-bodied organisms without hard parts, are essentially invisible in the fossil record unless very specific, very rare preservation conditions are met. We are reading the story of life on Earth through a keyhole, and the keyhole gets smaller the further back we look. This is not a conspiracy. It is not pseudoscience. It is the honest assessment of our own limitations. The geological record is the best tool we have for understanding the deep past, and it is an extraordinary tool, but it is not a complete record. It is a biased sample. It preferentially preserves hard-bodied organisms over soft-bodied ones. It preferentially preserves shallow marine environments over deep ocean ones. It preferentially preserves periods when conditions for fossilization were favourable and loses entire epochs when they were not. The Cambrian explosion looks like a sudden event, partly because the Cambrian was the first period when many organisms had hard parts that could fossilize readily. The Ediacaran biota looked like the first complex organisms, partly because the Ediacaran was the first period when unusual ocean chemistry allowed soft-bodied preservation on a large scale. Before those windows opened, the fossil record is nearly blind. Now, let me be very clear about what I'm not saying. I am not saying there was a lost civilization before the Cambrian. I am not saying there were complex animals walking around 1 billion years ago, and we just have not found them. I am not saying the mainstream scientific narrative is wrong. What I am saying is that the confidence with which we describe the deep Precambrian as a world of simple single-celled life rests partly on positive evidence, the fossils and chemical traces we have found, and partly on the absence of evidence of anything more complex. And in a system where evidence is systematically destroyed, absence is a weak foundation for certainty. The Ediacaran biota teaches this lesson directly. Before 1946, when Reg Sprigg found those impressions in the Ediacara Hills, no one knew they existed. The entire Precambrian was considered azoic, without life. That was the scientific consensus, and it was wrong. The Ediacaran organisms had been there for 40 million years, preserved in rocks on every continent, and nobody noticed because nobody was looking for them. Because the scientific consensus said they could not exist. The consensus was revised, as it should be. That is how science works. But the revision should teach us humility. The revision should remind us that absence of evidence, especially in a record as incomplete as the Precambrian geological record, is not a reliable guide to what did and did not exist, there are practical implications. Marine archaeology, the systematic exploration of submerged landscapes, is in its infancy. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than today. Vast areas of what is now continental shelf were dry land. If complex life existed along the Ice Age coastlines during the deep Precambrian, its remains would be buried under ocean water and marine sediment. We have barely begun to explore these submerged landscapes for recent archaeology, let alone for evidence of ancient biology. There is also the question of what lies in the unexplored portions of the rock record. Only a tiny fraction of the Earth's surface has been systematically surveyed for Precambrian fossils. The Ediacaran biota were found because specific locations happened to have the right preservation conditions and happened to be accessible to researchers. How many other locations around the world contain equally significant fossils that have not yet been found? How many Precambrian formations lie unexposed, unexcavated, unexamined? The honest answer is that we do not know, and we do not know how much we do not know, which is perhaps the most important thing the geological record teaches us, not what it contains, but how much it has lost. Let me tell you one more thing about the Ediacaran biota that haunts me. The rangeomorphs, those fractal, frond-shaped organisms that dominated the deep sea floor for roughly 10 million years, are known almost exclusively from a handful of sites: Mistaken Point in Newfoundland, Charnwood Forest in England, a few locations in Russia and China. These sites happen to preserve deep-water Ediacaran ecosystems because of specific geological circumstances that expose those ancient sea floors at the surface. But the deep ocean covers a vast area of the planet. The rangeomorphs were clearly successful organisms. They were abundant. They formed dense communities. They covered extensive areas of the seafloor. How much of that deep sea floor has been preserved? Almost none. The deep ocean floor from 560 million years ago has been subducted long ago. The only reason we know about the rangeomorphs at all is because a few small patches of ancient deep sea sediment were pushed up onto continental land by tectonic forces in just the right place, at just the right time, and happened to be exposed at the surface millions of years later, where someone happened to look at them. If those few patches had been subducted along with the rest of the ancient ocean floor, we would have no idea the rangeomorphs ever existed. An entire group of organisms that flourished for 10 million years, covering thousands of square kilometers of deep sea floor, would be completely unknown to us, as if they had never been. How many other groups of organisms are in that situation? How many other successful, abundant, widespread communities of Precambrian life were lost when the ocean floor that preserved them was recycled into the mantle? We cannot answer that question. We can only acknowledge it. The earth does not preserve, it erases, and what survives is not what mattered most, not what was most abundant, not what was most significant. What survives is what happened to be in the right place, at the right time, under the right conditions, to leave a mark that the planet could not grind away. Everything else is silence, and that silence extends across the full sweep of Precambrian time, across billions of years, across the vast majority of Earth's history. We peer into that silence with our geological tools and our fossil databases and our molecular clocks, and we see glimpses, flickers, shadows on the wall of a cave, and from those shadows we try to reconstruct what was, but the shadows are incomplete. They always will be. The Earth has made sure of that. So what are we left with? What do we actually know, and what can we honestly say we do not know? That is where we are going in our final chapter. So here we are, at the end of the journey, or perhaps if you have been paying attention, at the beginning of one. We have travelled from a frozen planet, locked in ice from pole to pole for tens of millions of years, to a global scar in the rock where over 1 billion years of history was erased. We have stood on an ancient seafloor covered in organisms so strange that 80 years of study has not fully resolved what they were. We have watched those organisms vanish, replaced in what might be the oldest mass extinction in Earth's history. We have followed the explosion that came after, the most dramatic burst of evolutionary creativity in the entire 4.5 billion year story of this planet. We have walked through a gallery of creatures so bizarre they were reconstructed upside down and backwards for decades. We have watched the invention of sight and the birth of the first arms race, and we have confronted the uncomfortable truth that the planet we are standing on actively destroys its own record, grinding away the evidence of what came before, year after year, epoch after epoch, eon after eon. Now we have to sit with the question we have been building toward all night, not answer it. Sit with it, because honest questions do not always have clean answers. Sometimes the most important thing a question can do is make you aware of what you do not know. Let us start with what we know for certain, not what we believe, not what the consensus holds, what we can demonstrate with physical evidence. We know that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. This is established by radiometric dating of the oldest known minerals and meteorites, and it is one of the most precisely measured quantities in all of geology. We know that life has existed on Earth for at least 3.5 billion years. The earliest unambiguous evidence comes from stromatolites and microbial fossils in rocks from Western Australia and South Africa. There are contested claims of even older biological signatures, but 3.5 billion years is the conservative floor. We know that for the first roughly 3 billion years of life's existence, it was almost entirely microbial. Single-celled organisms, bacteria, archaea, simple eukaryotes, no multicellular body plans, no organs, no tissues, no differentiation. Life was alive, but it was not complex in the way we think of complexity. We know that complex eukaryotic cells, cells with nuclei and internal organelles, have existed for at least 1.4 billion years. We have fossils, we have chemical biomarkers, the evidence is solid. We know from molecular clock studies, which estimate divergence times by analysing mutation rates in DNA, that basic animal lineages may have originated as far back as 700 to 800 million years ago. This is earlier than the oldest animal fossils. It implies that there is a gap between when animals first evolved and when they first appear in the fossil record, a ghost lineage. Animals that existed but left no physical trace that we have found. We know that approximately 720 million years ago, the Earth entered a period of extreme glaciation. The snowball Earth events of the Cryogenian period represent the most severe climate extremes of at least the last billion years. Ice covered the planet from pole to equator, possibly completely, possibly with a thin equatorial band of open water. Average surface temperatures dropped to roughly negative 50 degrees Celsius. The glaciations lasted for tens of millions of years. Life survived, but barely. In refugia near hydrothermal vents, volcanoes, or cracks in the ice. We know that when the ice melted roughly 635 million years ago, the world that emerged was chemically and ecologically transformed. Ocean chemistry had changed. Nutrient levels had shifted. Ecological space had been cleared. And within roughly 60 million years, the first large, complex, multicellular organisms appeared in the fossil record. We know that these organisms, the Ediacaran biota, flourished from approximately 575 to 539 million years ago. They were found on every continent. They included roughly 200 described species. They were unlike anything alive today. Most of them cannot be confidently classified into any modern kingdom or phylum. They had no mouths, no guts, no nervous systems in most cases. They appear to have absorbed nutrients passively from the water or from the microbial mats they rested on. We know that they were preserved because of a specific unusual set of conditions. Silica-rich oceans allowed rapid cementation of sand around their soft bodies. Microbial mats on the sea floor retained their impressions. Without these conditions, we would have no idea they existed. We know that they vanished at approximately the Ediacaran-Cambrian boundary, roughly 539 million years ago. The causes appear to include ecological replacement by new types of organisms, environmental stress including possible anoxic events, and the loss of the microbial mat ecosystem that supported them. A few rare survivors may have persisted into the Middle Cambrian, but the vast majority disappeared. We know that what replaced them was the Cambrian explosion. Beginning approximately 538.8 million years ago, and lasting roughly 13 to 25 million years, this event produced virtually every major animal body plan that exists today. Between 20 and 35 phyla appeared, eyes evolved, hard shells evolved, predation evolved. The arms race between predators and prey began and has not stopped. We know that the Burgess Shale, discovered in 1909 in the Canadian Rockies, preserves the most detailed snapshot of Cambrian life. Over 65,000 specimens, soft tissue preservation, organisms that were so bizarre they were misclassified for decades. Anomalocaris, the apex predator assembled from 3 separate misidentified organisms. Hallucigenia, the spiny worm that was reconstructed upside down and backwards for nearly 40 years. Upperbenia, the 5-eyed creature with a backward-facing mouth that made a room full of scientists burst into laughter when it was first presented. We know that the triggering factors for the Cambrian explosion likely included a rise in atmospheric oxygen, the evolution of predation, the opening of new ecological niches by burrowing organisms, the pre-existing genetic toolkit of Hox genes, and possibly the nutrient pulse from the Great Unconformity's eroded rock. We know that the Great Unconformity, first described by John Wesley Powell in 1869, represents a gap of up to 1.2 billion years in the rock record of the Grand Canyon, and similar gaps on every continent. New research published this very week suggests the primary cause was tectonic uplift associated with early supercontinent formation, not snowball Earth glaciation alone. We know that the geological record is systematically incomplete, that tectonic processes recycle the ocean floor every 200 million years, that erosion, subduction, and metamorphism destroy surface evidence over millions of years, that less than 1% of the organisms that have ever lived have left any fossil trace, that the further back in time we look, the less record survives, that entire epochs of Earth history are essentially invisible to us. These are the things we know. Now let me tell you what we do not know. We do not know what other complex organisms may have existed before the Ediacaran preservation window opened. The molecular clock evidence suggests animal lineages may have originated 100 to 200 million years before the oldest Ediacaran fossils. Where those organisms lived, what they looked like, how complex they were, and why they left no fossil record are all open questions. We do not know the full story of the end Ediacaran extinction. We know the broad outlines: ecological replacement, environmental stress, loss of microbial mats, but the specific mechanisms, the timing, the geographic pattern, and the completeness of the extinction are all still being investigated. We do not know why the Cambrian explosion happened when it did and not earlier. The genetic toolkit for building complex animal bodies appears to have been in place for hundreds of millions of years before the Cambrian. The oxygen levels needed to sustain Cambrian-style organisms were apparently modest. Why did the explosion wait? What was the final trigger? The combination of factors we have identified, oxygen, predation, ecology, genetics, nutrients, is compelling, but it is not the same as a complete explanation. We do not know what is buried beneath the continental shelves, the unexplored sedimentary formations, the deep marine deposits that have not yet been sampled. The Burgess Shale was discovered by accident. Mistaken Point was not recognized for what it was until 1967. The Ediacaran period itself was not formally ratified until 2004. Major discoveries in Precambrian paleontology are still being made regularly. The field is young and the territory is vast. We do not know how representative the Ediacaran biota are of the life that existed in the late Precambrian. They were preserved because of a chemical fluke. What else was alive that was not preserved? Were the Ediacarans the dominant life forms of their era, or were they one community among many, the one that happened to be in the right place at the right time to leave a fossil record? We cannot answer this, and we do not know what existed in the billions of years of Earth history that are represented by the great unconformity's silence. Over 1 billion years of rock gone. Whatever chemistry, whatever biology, whatever experiments in complexity that rock might have recorded, have been erased beyond recovery. These are not failures of science. They are the honest edges of knowledge, the boundaries where what we know meets what we cannot know, not because we lack intelligence or effort, but because the evidence has been destroyed by the very planet we are trying to study. And this is where the story becomes not just scientific but personal, because the question of what existed before us, what lived and died and was lost in the deep past, is ultimately a question about impermanence, about the relationship between time and memory, about what survives and what does not. The Ediacaran biota lived for 40 million years. 40 million years of quiet, strange existence on the seafloor, and then they were gone, replaced by something that did not care they had been there, something that did not know they had been there, something that could not know, because the world that emerged from the Cambrian explosion was so utterly different from the Ediacaran world that there was no continuity, no inheritance, no memory, just a boundary in the rock and a new chapter, beginning with no acknowledgements of what came before. The Rangermorphs covered thousands of square kilometers of deep ocean floor. They were successful by any biological measure, abundant, widespread, long-lived, 10 million years of dominance. And if not for a few tectonic accidents that pushed ancient seafloor sediments up onto land in Newfoundland and England, we would have no idea they ever existed. 10 million years of life, dependent for its remembrance on a geological coin flip. The Burgess Shale organisms are known to us because of a single mudslide in a single tropical sea in a single moment, 508 million years ago. A mudslide that buried them before they could decay. If that mudslide had not happened, or if it had happened a few hundred meters to the left, or if the resulting rock had been eroded or subducted before Charles Walcott's wife's horse stumbled on a slab of shale, we would not know about Anomalocaris or Hallucigenia or Opabinia or Picaya, the largest predator of the Cambrian seas, the ancestor of velvet worms, the five-eyed creature with the backward mouth, and possibly one of the earliest chordates in our own lineage. All of them would be unknown, lost as if they had never been. This should make us humble, not because it proves that something more complex than the Ediacarans existed before them. It might not have. But because it proves that our knowledge of the deep past is not determined by what existed. It is determined by what survived the process of erasure, and the process of erasure is thorough, relentless, and ongoing. The earth does not remember, it recycles. Continents are assembled and torn apart. Oceans are born and killed. Mountains rise and flatten. Rock is buried, heated, compressed, and reformed. The atoms that once made up ancient organisms are now scattered through layers of sediment, dissolved in ocean water, incorporated into magma, indistinguishable from the geological background. Not hidden, dissolves, return to the raw material of the planet. And in all of that, the few traces that survive, the Ediacaran impressions, the Burgess Shale fossils, the chemical signatures in deep-sea sediment cores, are not representative. They are survivors. They made it through the gauntlet of geological time by accident, by luck, by the right combination of burial depth and sediment chemistry and tectonic stability. They are the lottery winners of the fossil record, and we build our understanding of deep time on their testimony. That understanding is real, it is valuable, it is the best we have. But it is built on a foundation of survivors, and survivors do not tell you about the ones who are lost. 500 million years ago, something was here. We know this because we found it. Strange, alien beautiful organisms pressed into sandstone on every continent, frond-shaped creatures in the deep ocean, flat-ribbed animals on microbial mats, the first complex life on Earth, or at least the first complex life that was lucky enough to be preserved. And before them, in the billions of years of microbial monotony that preceded the Ediacaran, in the billion-year silence of the Great Unconformity, in the recycled and subducted ocean floors of deep Precambrian time, maybe nothing. Maybe the consensus is right. Maybe complex life genuinely did not evolve until the Ediacaran. Maybe the conditions were not right. Maybe the oxygen was too low, the ecology too simple, the genetic toolkit too primitive. Maybe the first 3 billion years of life on Earth really were just bacteria and algae, and slime, endlessly dividing in ancient seas, waiting for conditions to change. That is the most parsimonious explanation, the simplest interpretation of the evidence. And in science, simplicity counts for a great deal. But let me tell you something else that is true. For centuries, the most parsimonious explanation for the diversity of life on Earth was special creation. Each species was designed and placed by a creator. That was the simplest interpretation. It was wrong. For decades, the most parsimonious explanation for the shapes of the continents was coincidence. Africa and South America looked like they fit together, but so what? Coincidence. That was the simplest interpretation. It was wrong. The continents drift. For years, the most parsimonious explanation for mass extinctions was gradual climate change. Species slowly declined as conditions worsened. Then in 1980, Luis and Walter Alvarez found an iridium layer at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary and proposed that an asteroid had killed the dinosaurs. The simplest interpretation before that moment was wrong. Sometimes the universe throws rocks. The most parsimonious explanation is not always the correct one. It is the one we should favour in the absence of contradicting evidence, but we should hold it loosely. We should update it when new evidence arrives. We should remain aware of the difference between the evidence supporting our conclusion and the gaps in the evidence that our conclusion papers over. The Precambrian record has a lot of gaps. That is not a scandal, it is a fact. And facts are what we work with. So what do we do with all of this? First, we keep looking. The submerged continental shelves of the Ice Age world represent one of the largest unexplored geological frontiers on the planet. As technology improves, as deep-sea exploration becomes more accessible, as we develop new methods for detecting ancient biosignatures in deep sediment cores, we will learn more. Maybe much more. Maybe things that surprise us. Maybe things that confirm the consensus. Either way, the looking matters. Second, we keep questioning. The narrative of life on Earth as a simple upward progression from bacteria to complexity in a neat line is a story we tell ourselves. It is not the only story the evidence supports. The Ediacaran biota alone should make us humble. An entire world of complex organisms flourishing for 40 million years that was not even recognised by science until the mid-20th century. If we were wrong about the Precambrian being lifeless, what else might we be wrong about? What other assumptions are we making based on the absence of evidence rather than the presence of it? Third, we take the warning seriously. Whether or not anything complex existed before the Ediacaran biota, the story of life on Earth is a story of impermanence. The Ediacarans were here for 40 million years and then they were gone. The Cambrian fauna were replaced by new communities. The trilobites ruled the seas for hundreds of millions of years and then went extinct. The dinosaurs dominated for 165 million years and then a rock fell out of the sky. We are the current tenants. We have been here as a species for roughly 300,000 years, as a civilization for roughly 5 to 10,000, as an industrial civilization for about 300. On the 24-hour clock of Earth's history, we are a flicker, a spark, and the Earth is patient. It has outlasted everything that has ever lived on it, and it will outlast us. That is not nihilism, it is perspective. The same perspective that the Ediacaran Biota would have if they could look at us. We are the latest in a long line of experiments. Some experiments last longer than others, some leave traces, most do not. The question is not whether we will be remembered. Given enough time, the Earth will erase us too. The question is what we do with the time we have, what we learn, what we build, what we understand, what we preserve. The Ediacaran organisms did not know they were the first complex life on Earth. They did not know they were part of a story. They just lived. They absorbed nutrients, they grew, they reproduced, and when their world ended, they did not know that either. They simply stopped. But we know. That is the difference. We are the first species on this planet that can look back through the geological record and understand, however imperfectly, the story that came before us. We can see the snowball Earth. We can read the Great Unconformity. We can find the Ediacaran impressions and puzzle over them. We can walk through the Burgess Shale Gallery and wonder at the strangeness of early life. We can trace the line from Pikaia to ourselves and feel the weight of 500 million years pressing down on us. We are the first organisms in 4.5 billion years of Earth's history that can ask the question, what was here before us? And even though we cannot fully answer that question, even though the record is incomplete and the erasure is ongoing and the gaps may never be filled, the asking matters, the curiosity matters, the willingness to sit with uncertainty, to acknowledge what we do not know, to look at the deep past with honesty and humility rather than false confidence, that matters. Because the deep past is not just a collection of facts, it is a mirror. It shows us what we are, temporary, contingent, lucky. One experiment among many, living on a planet that does not care whether we succeed or fail, that will grind us down just as surely as it ground down everything that came before. And it shows us what we can be, the first species to know the story, the first to care about it, the first to try to read the faded, damaged, incomplete pages of a book that has been falling apart for billions of years, and to find in those pages something worth knowing, something beautiful and strange and humbling. 500 million years ago, the seafloor was covered in organisms that looked like nothing alive today. Flat-ribbed ovals absorbing nutrients through their skin, fractal fronds waving in deep ocean currents, creatures with no eyes, no mouths, no obvious purpose except to exist. They were the first great experiment in complex life, or the first one we know about. And they were beautiful, in the way that all strange and ancient things are beautiful, because they remind us how much we do not understand. They lived for 40 million years, then they were gone, and the world moved on as it always does. The Cambrian creatures replaced them without knowing they existed, and we found them 500 million years later, pressed into sandstone and tried to figure out what they were. We are still trying. The next time you hold a rock, any rock, turn it over in your hand. Feel its weight, its coolness, its age. That rock may have been formed on a sea floor where strange organisms lived and died and vanished millions of years ago. It may contain the last surviving trace of something that existed for epochs and left nothing else behind. Or it may contain nothing at all, just compressed mineral, silent and inert, holding no memory of what it witnessed. Either way, it is older than anything you have ever touched. It was here before us. It will be here after us. And the story it tells, the story of fire and ice and silence and sudden spectacular life, is the story of this planet. Our planet, the only one we have. We know what the rock tells us. We can only imagine what it has forgotten. If you enjoyed this deep investigation into the mysteries buried in Earth's oldest rocks, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We cover science, history, and the questions that stay with you long after the video ends. Tell me in the comments, what do you think existed before the Ediacaran Biota? Do you think the Cambrian explosion was truly the first explosion of complex life, or was there something earlier that the Earth erased? And what chapter of this planet's history would you like us to investigate next? These are not just questions for scientists. They are questions for all of us, because the past is not a closed book, it is an open dig, and every new discovery changes the story. Thank you for watching, thank you for your curiosity, and thank you for spending these hours with me, deep in the ancient past, asking questions that may never be fully answered, but that are always worth asking. I will see you in the next investigation.